It just seems to me that an additional sort of hazard in relation to the soils on the Port Hills is some of the massive gum trees and their lack of suitability for those soils. So have we got anything in the plan regarding those? I guess they're there now, or does that have to come under our trees policy?
Can you?
Like an example is that, for example, on Cashmere Hill, a good number of the hugely high and graceful Australian gum trees, okay, have collapsed, and there's been some soil movement with them, and that's been in times of heavy rainfall and wind throw, and destabilising the hill.
There's a very mixed feeling about vegetation, because on the one side, especially gum trees are often planted because they reduce the water table, they lower the...
Soak it up.
They soak up the... so that they're supposed to help. Trees are also supposed to help as a rockfall barrier as well, so there's no clear indication either way. As far as I'm aware, we don't have a policy of removing or planting vegetation either.
It'd be interesting to examine further, because when, for example, the branches lean right over, in effect, like a cliff, you could call it, okay? And I saw there was some movement just in the last 2 weeks, which has impacted on some of the residents, including movement of retaining walls. You've got to question the value, well, the risk really of them being in this location.
I agree. They can be a hazard.
There is nothing in the plan at the moment to remove trees, gum trees, or any other kind of tree.
Talking about trees, there was, if you're looking down...
No, not necessarily. Not necessarily. I mean, a lot of these trees, they may not be owned by council, they might be privately owned.
You can imagine a situation where a resource consent application was put in through this process, and an assessment matter or an assessment of that resource consent application might say something about the trees, and that's the level that you could probably look at a site by site and look at whether the trees are mitigating or whether they're accelerating the erosion. So I can imagine a site by site assessment of a resource consent that you could bring in some guidelines about, you know, which trees are helpful and which ones aren't. But this, I agree with Brigitte, there's nothing at the moment suggested. Yeah.
I have to say though, being raised in the North Island, Pūtakawa trees are just the same. It's not just gum trees that this relates to. So they have, you know, depending on the time of their life and whatever, you know, they can be useful, and then all of a sudden they tip over into, I guess, getting older and losing grip.
Oh yes. Yeah. They lose their grip.
On that actually very point, again down Barnvale Ave, there was a whole plantation of pine trees with a heavy rain event and a major wind event. They all blew over. Yeah. The entire lot blew over, and it's due to the soil, I would imagine. That
well, they're shallow rooting anyway. Pine trees is very shallow rooting.
But it's not necessarily a reason not to plant trees, though.
Good reason to plant natives.
Moving on.
Can I just refer councillors to map 46, because there's quite a few areas of mass movement identified there, including the mass movement 2 and 3. So if you look, you can find either Hillsborough Terrace or Bowenvale Avenue. Both have the mass movement 2 and 3. That's the mass movement 2 is the wide-spaced diagonal notation, green coloured, and then the 3 is sort of vertical purple, closer together notation. So you can see it effectively along the sides of the valleys there, with the Hillsborough Terrace and Bowenvale Avenue running along the bottom of the valley.
Moving on.
In terms of the issues, we've had not a lot of feedback, and I think that might reflect the fact that people living in the Port Hills have been supplied with a lot of information through the Port Hills Geotech group, and you know, the fact that they've been red zoned, so they've had a lot of information, many of them, not all of them of course, from the Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Authority and the council. In saying that, we had a good response, particularly and a good attendance at the meeting that we had at Redcliffs during the consultation phase. And as a result of the consultation, we have looked at the boundaries of the cliff hazard and rockfall 1 and 2 areas, and we've using the expert advice from the Sierra Geotech officer as well as our in-house advisor here, Ian Wright. We've worked through and managed to amend mapping on approximately 55 of the sites in the cliff hazard management area and just over 60 in the rockfall hazard management 1 areas. So what I need to explain here too is that the modelling is very good at an area-wide basis, but when it comes to the site-specific basis, it needs that ground truthing. And although we have had some ground truthing again at an area-wide basis, it wasn't necessarily done at a site-specific basis to then inform our mapping. So we've effectively done that. We've responded to some individual property owners' feedback, but we've done it on our own initiative as well. And that's largely meant that a number of the sites have either been removed, mostly they've been removed entirely from those mapping areas, or only a part of the site now remains. And so that was a very useful exercise. Also, as part of the feedback, and both from private owners and from the council staff themselves and other larger owners, we've identified that prohibited activity status is a bit too black and white. And stating the obvious, but there's always exceptions, and we've found that in combination with the way that the modelling can be applied, and it can be misinterpret site-specific features, like, for example, several times a steep slope has been interpreted by the model as a cliff collapse area, when the actual review identified that anomaly. It made that sort of thing, and also where rockfall had been identified, and in fact mitigation had been applied in recent times over the last couple of years, and so that hazard mapping for the rockfall didn't apply. So in combination of those sort of things made us realise that prohibited activity status is too onerous for cliff collapse and the mass movement 1 areas, that we should pull back a little bit. And I apologise in advance now that the table at Rule 510 should highlight the activities. I'm not sure which numbers they are. Oh yes, NC9 and NC11 as part of the rule table 511.1 should be highlighted in red. And they're the rules that we're proposing will go from prohibited activity status to non-complying, to enable that in those unique and reasonably discrete situations where we may need to consider the resource through a resource consent process, some development proposal where it's, for example, somebody wanting to develop a driveway or some other aspect of their site to give them some further protection or rebuild something that's been damaged to the earthquakes.
It's page 28, in case you're looking for it.
I'm clear. Are you saying there's basically no prohibited activities in any of these areas now?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you. I'm a little bit hard of hearing.
There's no prohibited activities
That's
in
what we're
any
proposing.
of these areas?
Yes.
So how do we align that with the whole red zone where people have been told it's too risky and they have, they've got a volunteer offer to leave, and we've got S124s?
Yes, well, I think, like I said, there are exceptions, and we're not anticipating that this rule would be taken up. It's a non-complying activity status. We're confident that our policies are strong enough to give that sort of direction, that in general development in these areas will be avoided. But if there are unique circumstances where some sort of development could be acceptable, then we've got that opportunity to consider it.
Yes, from my point of view, I'd rather see us have a process by which those in a prohibited area could get an exemption or an exception, rather than it just, like at the moment, everyone's really focused on the risk, and and we've had a Royal Commission, and they've been quite critical of ECAN and Council in terms of how our land use planning and how we allowed activity to occur. But over time, people kind of, as we move forward into the future, people get a little bit more relaxed. They forget about what happened. They feel, more comfortable with a higher level of risk because it's not as real. So I guess I just want to really, I think it just seems to me that there needs to be some areas where you just couldn't imagine people ever building a house.
Just an answer to your question, Councillor. I said we provided you with this again, just as a reminder or a reference sheet about the different types of consent activity status that you can have. And in fact, you can't have a prohibited status and then provide for exemptions to it. You can't accept any kind of consent if it's a prohibited activity. And that's why, as Fiona said, we can never crystal ball gaze and know that there isn't some situation in all of that area where there can be a particular site, because of its geology that it's sitting on, it may be protected by certain things. If it's a prohibited activity, they can never get a consent for it. But if it's non-complying, and as long as it says on that sheet, they can show how all the effects can be avoided, remedied or mitigated, etc. And it's also subject to all the objectives and policies of the plan. If they can show all of that, then they can get that consent. But that's the highest bar in planning terms that you can go for.
I guess, we've had 3 years of work following the earthquake to understand the geotech risks. Mm-hmm. I cannot accept that there are no areas that we've identified that are not ever suitable for development. I mean, there must be areas we've identified that are just simply not acceptable for development. That there's cliffs that you just need to look at some of the stuff driving to Sumner, where you look up and you go, there is no way anyone should ever be allowed to build on that cliff edge. Is there another group of, a separate group of areas that you could basically go, they definitely should be prohibited, and then there's some where you haven't done the ground truthing, which could be more, looked at going forward?
Yeah, just before Ian does, and I'm quite happy to defer to Ian because he's the specialist in geotech issues, but of course that's the way this council can choose whether it wants to do exactly that, prohibit certain areas and not allow for any exceptions in any case, or it can go the non-complying way. The way that we've proposed at the moment is non-complying, but I think it's a good idea to defer to the geotech here, who can tell you whether or not they're ever 100% sure that an area is safe or not until each site is looked at on the basis of that site.
Not so much interested in whether there's sites that you can look at that you can say it was unsafe and now it's safe. I guess what I'm really interested in is what are the areas you've looked at that there would never be an acceptable level of development allowed because it's just, forget it, and it's just too much.
So the decision was originally prohibited for, I think, any risk greater than 1/10,000 annual individual fatality risk for cliff collapse. Now that's probably, we've now gone the other way and said, well, and we know with the model there's issues in there, especially on the margins of the model where the cliffs reduced down to the side. So we can't put our hand over heart and say for every property in this region that it's a good call. So we'll hedge our bets. We'll go non-compliant, and then we'll look at each individual when it comes up in a consent. If we want to stack it a bit further, then I would recommend we go to the GNS model and you take the 10 to the -2 or the 10 to the -3 line, which is 1 in 10 chance or 1 in 100 chance, etc., of dying, and you look where those are, and you literally are standing under a cliff in that. And I, from a technical perspective, would say if you want to make those, that higher bar, because those are factors of 10 worse risk every time, those to me would be the cases where you just go, well, you won't even get a geotech person to wander in there and look at it, because he'll just say no, basically it's too scary. So I think within the GNS model information we have that ability if we wanted to go to that level.
So doesn't that seem sensible? I mean, if you couldn't get a GNS person to walk on that space, how would you ever allow somebody to build on that space? Isn't what you said just like in line with what Yanni's suggesting?
We had gone to the 10 to the 1 in 10,000 risk line and said everything above that is non-compliant. So you would have to convince council. And again, I'm not a resource but it's a high bar that you have to jump over to get permission. But what I'm saying is technically we have information that grades the level of risk right up to a very, very high risk that we could actually put in as prohibited.
We, in the current, and what we're suggesting here, actually allowed people, if they can get resource consent, to build on those very high levels of risk.
No, it's non-complying, but there are a number of criteria that has to be assessed. There's no prohibited activity, as Fiona's said at the moment, but one would suggest that it'd be highly unlikely that somebody would want to go and build in these areas that are known to be extremely risky. It's probably the ones slightly further away and on the edge, as Ian has said. No?
We do have to be careful because council has a rock protection structure guideline that shows people how, if they want to live in the red zone, which is typically greater than 10 to the -4 risk, can go about doing so by mitigating the risk. So we do have a...
So I can't see why we would allow people to build in an area that is incredibly dangerous and the high risk areas that you're talking about going up. So I can't...
Sorry, Madam Chair, perhaps I can assist in just clarifying the way the RMA provisions help us here. The current proposal here is that an activity in particular locations is deemed to be a non-complying activity, and you've got proposed objectives and policies in the plan that say we don't want people building in places where the risk is intolerable. And so whilst the plan would enable someone to apply for that non-complying activity, chances are the council as consent authority under the RMA is going to decline that application if the assessment is that the risk is too high. Now that's option 1 for plan provisions, and that's what we've got here. Option 2 for plan provisions, which was quite properly raised as an option for consideration, is that you break that category down into 2 categories or 3 categories. So it is possible to break that category down further. So you ring fence some of those locations and say, well, no, the council doesn't want to even allow someone to apply for a resource consent in that area. We'll deem it to be prohibited activity.
We can't learn something from previous mistakes. So I cannot see that we can even begin to put such risk around such developments. And I am not willing to entrust that to a future town planning committee of any sort. It just seems to me if the scientific explanation is that this is incredibly risky, then don't, for God's sake, build there. It just seems really clear. And the other question I have about it is, or the question I have about it, is whose liability is it when that building collapses onto other people down on the road or wherever they are? Councils?
If the council has exercised its decision-making role appropriately under the RMA, there isn't liability under the RMA for a planning decision.
Think on that now, because part of our decision-making process at the moment is, are we exercising our decision-making process properly? We're being told that some of these spaces have extreme risk. And then we're being suggested that we allow, subject to resource consent, for building to go on them. I can't get those things.
No, I don't think that's what you're being...
Well, we're not, we're saying these are not
told.
prohibited activities. I'm saying the only responsible decision is that that's a prohibited activity on spaces which are clearly not safe. And if I'm told by an expert that they're clearly not safe, I'm willing to listen to that and not take that chance.
It would be part of the space because, as Ian said, it's a 1 in 10,000 risk that these non-complying activities relate to. So it might be the 1 in 2 or 3,000 areas. So it's an area within that might then become prohibited, which can be done, which we have the information for, and then the remainder of it remains non-complying.
That makes a lot of sense. So, you might have 10 to the -4 to 10 to the -3 that you have a non-complying, and because it's in one of those kind of grey areas. I think, although there's been a science applied to the zoning and to some of the GNS stuff, I think the point that was made was actually at a very site-specific level, some areas have had that work, some areas haven't. So there will be things that come up that are anomalies because there's just the scale of doing that work will take time. But there will be areas that we know that are really, really risky, that actually if engineers won't walk under, then no one should be able to get a consent to build. So whether it's 10 to the minus 3 or 10 to the minus 2, that's probably the, we need to think about what would be the areas, and it would be interesting to get a map and say, what are the areas that would really be prohibited?
Yes, absolutely. So it would be for cliff and mass movement area 1 that we would be looking at that for. So those are the highest risk areas.
Well, all the same risk to life, but rockfall would be the big,
Rockfall.
certainly, and aerial extent would cover the greatest ground.
Okay. So can I just get agreement you would like us to map what might be considered prohibited as part of those areas? So it might be 10 to the minus 2, up to 10 to the minus 2 factor?
I would start at 10 to the minus 3 and above.
Okay.